The transmission came in at 3:47 in the morning, and I was already awake. I had not slept properly in 11 days. Not since the probe we found drifting past Jupiter began broadcasting coordinates, not to the Sun, not to Earth's electromagnetic signature, but directly to the orbital station where I happened to be working. As if it knew me. As if someone had been watching long enough to know exactly where to find me. My name is Dara Osai. I was 41 years old, a diplomat by trade, a reader of silences by nature. I had spent 15 years negotiating trade agreements between nations that hated each other, brokering ceasefires between governments that could not agree on the color of sky. I was good at it because I listened more than I spoke, and because I never flinched when the other side raised their voice. Voice raising, I had learned, was almost always fear pretending to be power. I did not know, the morning that transmission arrived, that I was about to meet the galaxy's oldest and most successful version of that exact trick. The message decoded itself. That was the first thing that made my stomach drop. It did not wait for our linguists, did not require our cryptographers, did not need the 6 months of painstaking work that had gone into the probe's initial signal. It simply arrived in English. Clean, grammatically precise English. The kind that had clearly been assembled by studying every broadcast humanity had ever leaked into space. I read it once. Then I read it again. Then I set my coffee down very carefully because my hands had started to shake and I did not want to spill it on the equipment. The message was from something called the Galactic Tributary Council. It described itself, in brief and efficient language, as a governing body representing 43 recognized civilizations across what it called the charted spiral. It informed me that Earth had been under observation for 214 years. It told me that humanity had now crossed the threshold of what the Council defined as detectable technological maturity. And it explained, in the same tone one might use to describe a parking fine, that as a newly detected Tier 0 civilization, Earth was now subject to the standard tribute assessment. The tribute list followed. It was 3 pages long. Raw iridium, compressed atmospheric samples, genetic sequencing data from no fewer than 10,000 human volunteers, detailed topographical maps of every continent, and at the bottom of the list, almost as an afterthought, a line that I read 4 times before I was certain I had understood it correctly. Personnel contribution: 2,000 individuals between the ages of 18 and 35, to be selected by Earth's governing representatives, for integration into Council labor and research programs. 2,000 people. I put the message down. I walked to the viewport and looked at the black outside. The stars were exactly where they had always been. Nothing had changed out there, and yet everything had changed. The Council's message ended with a deadline. 72 hours. Earth was to confirm receipt, acknowledge the assessment, and submit a preliminary tribute schedule. Failure to comply would result in what the message called corrective engagement. It did not elaborate on what that meant. It did not need to. The phrasing was chosen deliberately, the way all truly threatening language is chosen, vague enough to let the imagination do the work. Within 6 hours, I had been pulled off every other assignment I had. Within 12, I was on a secure channel with 6 heads of state and the Secretary General of the United Nations. Within 18, I had been formally appointed as Earth's sole responding representative. Not because I was the most senior diplomat available, not because I had any special qualifications for first contact with an alien governing body, but because, when the Secretary General had asked the room full of generals and scientists and politicians what they thought we should do, I had been the only one who did not immediately start talking. "You just sat there," the Secretary General told me afterward during a private call. "Everyone else was already arguing. You just sat there and read the message again." "I was thinking," I said. "What were you thinking?" I told her I would let her know when I had finished. They gave me the response channel, access to a small team of translators and analysts, and a room on the station with a desk and a chair and a viewport that faced away from Earth. I think someone arranged that last part deliberately. Looking at Earth while carrying this particular weight would have made it very difficult to think clearly. The Council's liaison arrived 14 hours before the deadline. It came aboard the station via a docking mechanism that simply appeared on our port side without any prior contact, a detail that told me more about the Council's capabilities than any of their documentation. The liaison was called Threshold of 7. I am rendering its name in English because the actual vocalization required a frequency range outside human hearing. It was tall, roughly 3 meters, covered in a smooth gray integument that shifted faintly when it moved, the way a deep-water fish changes color in response to light. It had 4 upper limbs, 2 of which it used for movement, and 2 of which it held in a configuration that my translator told me indicated formal neutrality. It did not threaten me. That was the part I found most interesting. It sat across from me in the station's small briefing room and explained, in the manner of someone who has delivered the same explanation a very large number of times, that the Tributary Council was not a hostile body. That tribute was not punishment. That it was, in fact, a mark of recognition, proof that humanity had been deemed significant enough to be formally included in the charted spiral's economic and cultural framework. Many civilizations, Threshold of 7 said, never reached Tier 0 assessment at all. What happens to those civilizations? I asked. It paused. They are not relevant to your situation. I'm curious, I said. Curiosity, it said, is noted as a common characteristic of your species. I asked it what the enforcement mechanism was for non-compliance. It told me that corrective engagement varied based on the specifics of each situation, but that no Tier 0 civilization had ever required its full application. I asked it how many Tier 0 civilizations had refused the tribute assessment outright. It was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to be meaningful. The question is not applicable, it said. The assessment is not a negotiation. Everything is a negotiation, I said. I've been doing this for 15 years. It looked at me with eyes that were horizontal slits, pale amber, utterly still. You are very small, it said, and I could not tell, even afterward, whether it meant me specifically or humanity in general, and I decided it did not matter because the answer was the same either way. It left. The deadline clock ticked down. I sat at my desk and read the tribute list one more time, stopping at the line about 2,000 people. I thought about who they would be. I thought about how they would be chosen. I thought about the fact that someone on Earth would have to look 2,000 people in the eyes and explain that their names had been written on a list they had never agreed to be on. And I thought about every negotiation I had ever sat in, every government that had rattled its power like coins in a jar to see if the sound would make the other side blink first, every demand dressed up as a standard procedure, every threat hiding inside bureaucratic language. I had heard all of it before, just never from this far away. I picked up the response terminal. I looked at the cursor blinking on the empty reply field. Then I put the terminal back down, walked to the small storage cabinet in the corner of the room, found a notepad and a pen that someone had left behind, and brought them back to the desk. I did not write anything yet. I just wanted the pen in my hand. There is something about holding a pen that focuses the mind in a way that keyboards never quite manage. A pen commits you. A pen means you have already decided. And I had. I just needed to be completely sure that I meant it. Outside the viewport, the stars were still exactly where they had always been. 2,000 years of human civilization had looked up at them and wondered what was out there. Now we knew, and what was out there had sent us a bill. I held the pen. I thought about what I was going to say, and slowly, with the particular calm that comes not from the absence of fear but from having looked at it long enough that it becomes familiar, I stopped shaking. The station had a lower deck that most of the senior staff never used. It was technically listed as a recreational area, which meant it had a long corridor of small windows, a few folding chairs bolted to the floor, and a water dispenser that had been broken for 6 months. It was where the younger crew members went when they needed somewhere quiet. I found out about it from a young man named Owen Cartwright, who was 22 years old and worked in the station's communications relay department. He had dark circles under his eyes that had nothing to do with shift schedules, and he moved through the station with the careful, slightly hunched posture of someone carrying a weight they were trying not to let anyone else notice. I had seen his name on a list 3 days earlier, not the council's list, a preliminary internal document that Earth's coordinating committee had begun assembling, a list of people who might be considered for the personnel tribute should we ultimately decide to comply. Owen Cartwright was on it. His name appeared near the top, flagged because he had no immediate family dependents, no critical infrastructure role, and a skill set the council's intake documents had specifically requested. He did not know his name was on it. I was certain of that from the way he said hello to me in the corridor, a little shy, slightly surprised that someone as visibly senior as I was had made eye contact with him. "You're the one talking to them," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm the one responding to them," I said. "There's a difference." He thought about that. "Is there really?" "Yes," I said. "Talking to someone means you're having a conversation. Responding to someone means you're deciding how to answer a question they've already decided the answer to." He leaned against the wall of the corridor and looked out through one of the small windows. The stars were pale and fixed and indifferent. "What are you going to say?" "I haven't decided yet," I said, which was partly true. I had decided on the shape of it. I had not yet decided if I had the right. We stood there for a while, not speaking. Owen told me eventually that he had grown up in a small town in the north of England, the kind of place where the sky was wide and the winters were long, and people had a habit of understatement, of saying not bad when they meant beautiful, and a bit much when they meant unbearable. He said he had studied communications because he liked the idea of being the person who made sure the signal got through clearly, no matter how much interference was in the way. "That's a good way to think about it," I said. "Are you scared?" he asked. He said it the way young people sometimes ask things directly, without the careful framing that comes with age and professional caution. I considered lying. I considered the diplomatic non-answer. Then I thought about the weight he was carrying without knowing he was carrying it, and I decided he deserved better than performance. "Yes," I said, "but not in the way I expected. I'm not scared of them. I'm scared of what it would mean if we say yes." He looked at me. "What would it mean?" I picked my words carefully. "It would mean we agreed that some people matter more than others, that 2,000 people can be decided about without their knowledge or consent, that the size of the thing asking determines whether the answer is allowed to be no." I paused. "I've seen that logic used before, on a smaller scale, by humans. It never ends anywhere good." Owen was quiet. Then he said very softly, "I think I know what you're going to say." I said nothing. I went back to my room. What I did not tell him was what I had found that afternoon in the station's archive system, a sealed historical record that one of my analysts had flagged from the council's own data packet. Buried 3 layers deep inside the formal documentation, accessible only because the council had included it as a precedent reference, was a record of 31 civilizations that had failed to meet their tribute assessments. Not 31 that had refused, 31 that had failed through poverty, through political collapse, through simple inability to meet the numbers. All 31 had been designated as corrective engagement cases. 26 of them no longer had any detectable population signature. The other 5 had been reclassified as integrated resource territories, which the Council's glossary defined as regions under direct Council administrative management. There were no further population records for those either. I sat with that information for a long time. Then I looked for records of civilizations that had refused outright, not failed, refused, declined the assessment deliberately with full awareness of what the council was. There were none in the documentation. The absence of that data was itself a kind of data. My senior analyst, a woman named Claire Henley who had worked in international law for 20 years and had a talent for finding the thing everyone else had agreed not to look for, came to my room late that evening with a single sheet of printed notes. "There's a gap," she said, putting the paper on my desk. "The council's records go back 800 years. The tribute system goes back 600. But there's a 40-year window, roughly 260 years ago, where the compliance rate in the records drops to zero. Not because everyone complied, because the records for that period are incomplete." "Incomplete how?" "Missing, selectively. Only the records for 12 specific civilizations in that period, all of them Tier 0 assessments, all of them in the same region of the charted spiral." I looked at her notes. "What do you think happened?" "I think," she said carefully, "that some of them said no, and I think the council decided it was better to have no record of that than an accurate one." I folded the paper and held it for a moment. Why would they be afraid of the record? Claire looked at me with the expression of someone who has already followed the thought to its conclusion. Because if the record existed, other civilizations would see it, and if other civilizations saw it, they might ask what happened. And if they asked what happened, they might discover that saying no does not automatically result in the outcomes the council implies it results in. I put the paper in my pocket. I went back to the window. Outside, the stars had not moved. They never do from where we sit. They only look fixed because we are too close to see the motion. My daughter called at some point past midnight, the signal delayed by the distance between the station and Earth, so that our conversation moved in long, awkward beats. She was 17 and sharp in the way that people become when they grow up watching adults struggle with problems the adults insist on treating as complicated. "Everyone here is terrified," she said. "I know. Are you going to fix it?" "I'm going to answer it," I said. "Fixing it is a longer process." "Mum," her voice was dry, impatient, a little fond, "don't embarrass us." I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in 4 days, and it surprised me by feeling real. "I'll do my best." "Tell me what you're going to say." "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because if I say it out loud before I'm completely ready, it becomes a performance. And it needs to not be a performance. It needs to just be true." She was quiet for a moment. The signal delay made the silence longer than it was. "Okay," she said finally. "I trust you." I held the comm terminal after the call ended and thought about trust, about how it works, about how it is extended, usually, not on the basis of certainty, but on the basis of knowing someone well enough to believe they will not waste it. 8 billion people who did not know my name were about to extend it to me anyway, not because they had chosen me, because there was no other option. I went back to the desk. The notepad was still there. The pen was still there. I picked it up again. This time I wrote something, one word. I looked at it for a long time, to make sure I meant it all the way through, not just in the part of me that was certain, but in the parts of me that were afraid and tired and fully aware of what it might cost. I meant it. I put the pen down. I looked out at the stars. Tomorrow I would stand in front of 43 civilizations and say the word I had just written. But tonight it was enough to have written it, to have held it in my hands in ink on paper, small and plain and absolute. It is strange how much power fits inside 2 letters. The chamber was built to make you feel small. I understood that the moment the transport pod broke through the docking seal and I stepped into the council's relay station, a structure roughly the size of a small moon, assembled from materials I could not name in colors that should not have existed, hanging in the space between star systems like an architectural argument for the permanence of hierarchy. Everything about it was designed with intention. The corridors were just wide enough that a human had to walk slightly behind the beings escorting them. The ceilings were just high enough to make human scale feel diminished. The lighting was calibrated, my analyst Claire had warned me, to the comfort range of the Council's senior species, which meant it was slightly too dim for human eyes and carried a faint warmth in the wrong part of the spectrum, so that everything I looked at had a barely perceptible wrongness to it, like a familiar room rearranged by 2 inches in every direction. I had been in rooms designed to diminish me before, negotiating tables where the chairs were lower on one side, offices where the light came from behind the other person's head, conference rooms where the coffee was placed just out of comfortable reach. Humans do it to each other constantly, usually without admitting it. The Council did it structurally, architecturally, at a scale that suggested long practice. I straightened my back and walked at my own pace and said nothing about any of it. The Council chamber itself was a sphere, not a hemisphere, not an amphitheater, but a true sphere, with observation platforms arranged at every angle so that representatives from every species were looking inward at the same central point from different heights and orientations. Some of them were upside down relative to my position. The effect was deliberately disorienting. It meant there was no head of the table, no position of visual authority. Except, of course, there was. The arbiter's platform was positioned at dead center of the sphere, suspended in open air by a system I did not understand, at a height that placed it fractionally above every other platform in the chamber. The difference was small enough that most species might not consciously register it. I registered it immediately, because I had spent 15 years learning to notice exactly that kind of thing. The arbiter was called Senvale. It was a species I had not encountered in any of the Council's documentation, elongated, silver pale, with a structure that suggested significant internal complexity, moving with a slowness that implied either great age or extraordinary deliberateness. Its voice, when it spoke, was rendered through the translation system as a clean baritone, which I suspected was not its natural register, but rather a frequency selected to communicate authority to the widest range of listening species simultaneously. The chamber was full, every platform occupied. Claire, watching remotely from the relay station, told me afterward that she had counted representatives from 41 distinct species, some present in person, some transmitted as precision holograms, all of them watching the same central point, which was me. I was the only human in the room. I had requested no escort, no support staff, no additional diplomatic presence. The Council's protocol permitted up to 12 representatives for any responding civilization. I had submitted one name. My own. Senvale began the session. It spoke in 12 languages simultaneously, each layered into the translation system so that every species in the room heard the opening statement in their own tongue. I heard English. It was a formal recitation, the history of the charted spiral's tributary framework, its purpose, its scope, its benefits to participating civilizations. The language was careful and balanced and managed, very skillfully, to describe an extraction system as though it were a gift. I had read the same language in the documentation. I listened to it again without expression. Then Senvale turned to the matter of Earth's assessment. It read the tribute list aloud in full, all 3 pages, every line, including the personnel contribution at the bottom. 41 civilizations heard the list of what humanity was expected to give, and the chamber was quiet in a way that felt practiced, the quiet of an audience that has heard this before and knows what comes next. What comes next in the Council's framework was acknowledgement, a formal statement of receipt and compliance, a preliminary schedule, a gesture of institutional submission that would then be processed, documented, and filed as precedent. Senvale finished reading. The chamber was still. Every eye, every sensor, every monitoring system in that vast sphere oriented toward me. Ambassador Osai, Senvale said, Does the civilization of Earth acknowledge the Tier 0 assessment as delivered, and does it submit its intention to comply with the standard tribute schedule? I stood up. Not because the protocol required me to stand. It did not. I stood because I wanted to. Because I wanted the representatives of 41 civilizations to see a human standing on their own 2 feet in the center of their sphere, in their light that was calibrated to make human eyes slightly uncomfortable, and to understand from the posture alone that what was about to happen was fully deliberate. I looked at Sen Vale. I looked at the platforms ringing me. I took a breath that I did not hurry. And I said it. No. One word, one syllable, no elaboration, no preamble, no apology and no threat. Just the word clean and direct placed into the air of the chamber and left there. Then I sat back down. The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had ever been inside. It was not the silence of shock exactly. It was not the silence of offense, or of outrage, or of the kind of theatrical pause that powerful bodies use to signal their displeasure. It was something stranger and more complete. It was the silence of a system encountering an input it did not have a category for. The Council's tributary framework was 600 years old. In 600 years, the compliance process had run in one direction. Species received the assessment. Species submitted the schedule. Some negotiated the details, some requested extensions, some required additional sessions to manage internal political resistance. But the direction of the process toward compliance had never, in the documented history of the framework, simply stopped. 41 civilizations sat in a sphere and did not know what to do next. I watched them. It was one of the most extraordinary things I have ever seen, not the grandeur of the chamber, not the alienness of the beings around me, but the simple fact of confusion, real confusion. The kind that does not know how to arrange itself into a response because it has not had to do this before. Threshold of 7 was on a platform to my left and slightly above. I had noticed it before the session began. Now I looked at it directly. Its pale amber eyes were fixed on me with an expression I had been thinking about since our first meeting, that quality it had shown when I had pushed back on its mathematics argument. That thing I had tentatively identified as the beginning of concern. It was not the beginning of concern anymore. It was the full version. On a platform to my right, at a lower level, was a delegation I had not seen in any of the documentation. They were small, slight, with structured plumage in muted blues and silvers, arranged in a group of 3. I had been told their species was called the Churith. I had been told almost nothing else about them because they were listed in the Council's records as a Tier 3 compliant tributary with no significance flag, which turned out to mean they had been compliant for so long and so quietly that the Council had stopped paying them attention. One of the 3 was watching me with an expression I recognized, not confusion, not alarm, something sharper, something that looked like recognition. Sen Vale spoke. The translation system rendered it calmly, but there was something in the pace of the delivery that told me even the Arbiter's own composure was working harder than usual. Ambassador Osai, the question requires a formal response. Does Earth submit its compliance? I looked up at Sen Vale. I gave you a formal response. A single-word reply does not constitute a formal. It constitutes the only formal response that is available to me, I said, because the only formal responses to a yes or no question are yes and no. You asked if we comply. The answer is no. The word is complete. The record can reflect it however you prefer, but the answer does not change. The chamber made sounds I could not fully interpret. Movement on platforms. Communication between delegates through channels I was not monitoring. The kind of lateral activity that happens in any large body when something unexpected occurs, and the assembled members are rapidly trying to determine whether they are experiencing a protocol gap or something more significant. It was more significant. I already knew that. I think some of them were beginning to know it too. Senvale called a procedural recess. 30 minutes. The platforms buzzed. Threshold of 7 descended from its position and moved toward me at a pace that managed to be purposeful without being aggressive. The walk of someone who wants to look like they are in control of what is happening. It stopped in front of me and looked down. What you have done is irregular. I answered a question, I said. No Tier 0 civilization has refused assessment. Then the record just became more accurate, I said. A record that only reflects the outcomes of compliance is not a complete record. It is a selection. Something shifted in its face. I had been watching Threshold of 7 long enough now to have begun reading it, and what I saw in that moment was not anger. It was something closer to a very old and very practiced certainty beginning to develop a crack. You understand what corrective engagement means, it said. I understand what you imply it means, I said. I notice you have not described what it actually is. The description is not necessary at this stage. Then perhaps it will be necessary at the next stage, I said. I am ready for the next stage. It held my gaze for a moment that stretched. Then it turned and went back to its platform without another word. I sat alone at the center of the sphere. 41 civilizations were in recess around me. Claire was watching through the relay feed. Owen was somewhere on the station, moving through his day without knowing that his name had been on a list and was not going to be on it any longer. I was afraid. I want to be clear about that. I was genuinely, thoroughly afraid. But fear, I have found, is loudest right before you act. The moment you act, it goes quiet. Not because it is gone, because it has accepted that you are going anyway and decided to come with you instead of fighting you. I folded my hands on the desk in front of me and waited for the recess to end. Whatever came next, the word was already in the record. They could recess for 30 minutes or 30 years. The answer did not change. No does not have a shelf life. The recess lasted 47 minutes. I know because I counted. Not obsessively. I simply have the kind of mind that tracks time without being asked. A habit built from years of negotiations, where knowing exactly how long the other side took to respond to a difficult moment told you more about their position than anything they said afterward. 47 minutes was interesting. 30 would have meant confidence. 60 would have meant genuine disorder. 47 was the number of a body that needed time to resolve an internal disagreement without admitting it was having one. When Senvale returned to the Arbiter's platform, something in its posture had shifted by approximately 5 degrees, barely visible, completely legible to me. It spoke. The translation came out measured, clean, in that same calibrated baritone. The Council notes Earth's preliminary response. In accordance with Section 41 of the Tributary Charter, a formal clarification period of 14 standard days is hereby opened. During this period, Earth's delegation is invited to submit a revised position or to present any extenuating documentation it believes relevant to the assessment. I had not expected that. 14 days was not a punishment. It was not a warning. It was a door being opened, sideways, quietly, without any of the participants officially acknowledging that it was happening. In the language of international bodies, which I had spent my career learning to read, it meant, we are not yet sure how to proceed, and we need time to discuss it among ourselves without this being in the record as uncertainty. I stood up. The delegation of Earth thanks the Council for the clarification period, I said. Earth's position will not change, but Earth is open to discussing the framework within which that position is being evaluated. Senvale's pause was exactly 3 seconds. Noted. The session closed. I was escorted back to the docking corridor by a different set of functionaries than the ones who had brought me in, which was also interesting. And then I was back in the transport pod. And then I was back on Relay Station Helios. And Claire was standing at the docking bay door looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. They gave you 14 days, she said. Yes. They have never done that before. I know. What does it mean? I took off my jacket and folded it over my arm. It means they had a conversation during that recess. A disagreement. Someone inside the council argued for immediate corrective engagement and someone else argued against it. The someone else won, but only barely, and only because they needed more time to figure out which argument was actually stronger. Claire looked at her notes. That means there's a faction. There's always a faction, I said. In every body large enough to call itself a governing structure, there is always the group that benefits from the current arrangement and the group that merely tolerates it. The tribute system has been running for 600 years. 600 years is long enough for the group that merely tolerates it to have become very quietly unhappy. I went to my room. There were 17 messages from Earth's coordinating committee, ranging in tone from urgent to near frantic. I read them all, responded to none of them immediately, and went to the viewport. Then I did something I had been thinking about since the day Claire had found the gap in the council's records. I went to my communication terminal, opened the station's broadcast array, and transmitted a complete audio and visual record of the session, including my response, on every open frequency the station could reach. Not just toward Earth, in every direction. The broadcast would take time to travel. Space is large and signals move at the speed of light, which is fast in human terms and slow in galactic ones. But it would go. It would reach the relay networks. It would propagate through the frequency bands the Council used for tributary communications, the bands that every assessed civilization monitored because the Council's updates came through them. Every compliant civilization in the charted spiral was going to hear a Tier 0 assessment response, and the response was going to be a single word. Claire found out what I had done 20 minutes later, and came to my room with the specific expression of someone who has decided that objecting is probably pointless, but cannot entirely stop themselves. They will not be happy, she said. They were already not happy. This changes the texture of the unhappiness. What does that mean practically? It means, I said, that the conversation they were having internally is now a conversation that the rest of the galaxy can hear echoes of, and some of those who hear it will have thoughts. She sat down, she thought about it for a long time. The Churith, she said finally. I looked at her, tell me what you found. Because Claire had found something. I had seen it in her face when she met me at the docking bay, not just the news about the 14 days, but something else, something she had been working on while I was in the chamber. She put her notes on the desk. The Churith have been tributary members for 180 years, Tier 3 compliant, meaning their tribute is relatively light and they have no personnel contribution requirement. But I pulled their original assessment record. She paused. They were initially assigned Tier 0. I sat very still. They negotiated down. That's what the record says, but the negotiation is described in 3 lines, which is unusual. Typical negotiation records run to dozens of pages. 3 lines suggests the record was summarized after the fact. She met my eyes. Or edited. Or they refused, I said, and something happened that the Council would prefer not to have documented as a successful refusal. 180 years ago, Claire said, which is inside the window I found earlier, the 40-year gap. We looked at each other. The Churith delegate who was watching me, I said, during the session. I noticed that too. I want to channel to them, unofficial, through the lowest traffic frequency band we have access to. She was already writing it down. I'll have it in 2 hours. The channel came through in 90 minutes. The Churith delegate, the one who had watched me with that particular expression of recognition, identified themselves by a tone sequence I rendered in my notes as Sill. Their translated voice was light, layered, with a quality that reminded me of someone speaking carefully in a room where they were aware of the acoustics. You said no, Syl said. Yes. No one says no. Someone just did. A pause. We said no 179 years ago, but there were 3 of us and we said it at the same time and we did not say it in the chamber. Another pause longer. We said it privately, and the council offered us Tier 3 reclassification in exchange for our public compliance. We took it. We were afraid. I held the communication terminal carefully. What happened to the others, the ones who refused in that period? Some were absorbed, some were corrected, some, the voice hesitated. Some we do not know about. Their signals stopped. We were told it was corrective engagement. We believed it because we were afraid not to. And now? Syl was quiet. Then, now a Tier 0 civilization has said no in the chamber on the record, broadcast to every frequency, and the council gave them 14 days rather than immediate correction. A pause that carried weight. We have been waiting 179 years for that to happen. I closed my eyes for a moment, opened them. What do you need? To not be alone when we say it again, Syl said. That is all. We never needed anything else. I spent the next 3 days doing the work that no one would ever see in the official record. The quiet, careful, lateral work of reaching out through indirect channels to species that Claire and I had identified as potentially belonging to that long-suppressed internal faction. Not proposing anything. Not demanding anything. Simply sharing the broadcast. Simply making sure that those who needed to hear it had heard it clearly. On the 4th day, Earth's coordinating committee finally reached me with a message that had moved past frantic into something quieter. The Secretary General herself, on a private line. Tell me the truth, she said. Are we going to be all right? I thought about all the things I could say, all the careful diplomatic framings, all the measured language of uncertainty and process and probability assessment. Yes, I said, but not because they backed down, because they were never as strong as they appeared. The strength was borrowed from our belief in it. She was quiet for a moment, and now we don't believe it. Now we don't believe it, I said, and neither, I think, do a few others. On the 9th day of the clarification period, 3 things happened in quick succession. The first was a formal communication from a species called the Vren, a Tier 2 tributary civilization whose assessment records I had studied carefully, requesting access to Earth's broadcast transmission logs for documentary purposes. It was phrased as a routine archival request. It was not a routine archival request. The second was a message from Threshold of 7. No preamble, no formal salutation, just text, rendered through the translation system in its flat, efficient register. We modeled every possible human response to the assessment. 147 probability branches. We did not include the branch you chose because our models assumed every civilization operates from a primary motivation of self-preservation above principle. We are revising the models. This is noted for your information. I read it twice, then I sent back 2 words, "You're welcome." The third thing was a quiet notification from Claire, relayed through our internal system at just past midnight. 2 other civilizations, both Tier 0 assessed within the past 50 years, had submitted responses to their pending tribute schedules. Both responses were a single word. 6 months later, I was sitting in my garden. It was a small garden, more accurately a patch of grass and raised beds behind a house in the east of England that I had bought 12 years ago and had not spent nearly enough time in. The tomatoes were doing well this year, which was surprising given that I had planted them late and watered them inconsistently, and had been, for most of the past 6 months, approximately 60,000 kilometers from home. A journalist named Fiona Marsh was sitting across from me with a recording device on the table between us, a cup of tea going cold at her elbow, and the look of someone who had come prepared for a formal interview and discovered that the subject intended to have a conversation instead. She had been asking questions for 40 minutes. I had answered most of them honestly and one or two of them incompletely, in the way that honesty sometimes requires when the full answer involves other people's private moments. But her last question was the one I had been expecting since she arrived, the one every journalist had been building toward in every conversation I had been part of since I came back to Earth, and I thought she deserved a real answer. She had asked, "What were you thinking when you said it?" I looked at the garden for a moment. The tomatoes, the overgrown border of lavender that I kept meaning to trim and never did, a spider working something intricate and patient between two canes. "I was thinking about a young man named Owen Cartwright," I said. "He was 22 years old and he worked in communications, and his name was on a list that he didn't know existed. I was thinking about what that list meant, and what it would mean for there to be more lists like it, and what kind of world we were choosing if we decided that some people could be written down on lists by other people who had more power than them, without their knowledge or their consent." Fiona wrote something in her notebook, and that was enough too. "It was everything," I said. "The galactic politics of it, the enforcement questions, the factional analysis, all of that mattered, all of that was real. But the actual moment of deciding was much simpler. Someone had put a 22-year-old on a list, and I did not think that was acceptable, and I was the person holding the pen." She looked up. "Do you think you were brave?" I thought about that seriously, because it deserved to be thought about seriously. "No," I said finally. "I think I was clear. Clarity is different from bravery. Bravery is when you do something in spite of being afraid. Clarity is when the fear and the decision stop fighting each other and agree on the same direction." She smiled a little. "That sounds like something you practiced." "I only ever say things I have thought through," I said, "but that does not make them less true." We sat for a moment while she finished a note. Behind the house, somewhere on the street, someone was mowing a lawn. The ordinary sound of a Saturday afternoon in a country that was, improbably and against every expectation, not at war with anyone, including anyone in the charted spiral. The Galactic Tributary Council, as of the most recent update from Claire, was in what the official communiques called a period of structural review. Tribute collection had been suspended pending an arbitration process that was projected to take between 2 and 7 years, depending on which of the Council's internal factions gained sufficient procedural ground to define the terms. The Churith had submitted a formal petition for review of their original assessment classification, a document that was, according to Syl, 179 years overdue. The Vren had submitted a similar petition. So had 4 others. The 2 Tier 0 civilizations that had sent single-word responses to their tribute schedules were now in their own clarification periods. Neither had been subjected to corrective engagement. The Council had used the same procedural mechanism it had used with Earth. The 14-day door opened sideways, the unofficial acknowledgement that something in the calculus had changed. Threshold of 7 had not contacted me again after my 2-word reply, but Syl had told me that it had been reassigned from active liaison work to what the Council's internal structure called Observational Advisory, a title that Syl's translation characterized, with what I had come to recognize as the Churith version of dry humor, as a very dignified way of being moved to a room with no window. None of this was settled. I want to be clear about that. A 600-year-old system does not transform in 6 months. The Council still existed. The tributary framework still existed. The power differentials that had made it possible were still real, still embedded, still enforced by factors much larger and older than my one-word answer in a spherical chamber. The work ahead was the long, slow, grinding work of building something different. And most of that work would be done by people who were not me, in rooms I would not be in. Over years, I was not confident I would live to see the end of. But the direction had changed. The record was different, and a crack in a very old wall, even a small crack, is not the same as a wall with no crack in it. Owen Cartwright arrived at my garden gate at 2:30. He had driven up from London. where he had been working for the past 3 months as a communications coordinator for Earth's newly established Galactic Relations Office, a department that had not existed 8 months ago and now occupied an entire floor of a building near the Thames. He was still 22. He still moved with that careful posture, but the weight underneath it was different now. Not the invisible burden of being unknowingly listed, but the ordinary weight of someone young doing important work and aware of how much depended on it. He had found out about the list, about his name being on it. He had found out 4 months ago when someone who should not have mentioned it, and I had been warned by Claire before he called me and had spent 20 minutes preparing what I was going to say. He had not let me say any of it. He had called and there had been a pause, and then he had simply said, "Thank you for what you did." And I had said, "You would have done the same." And he had said, "I would have wanted to." And we had left it there, which seemed like enough. Now he was at my garden gate with a bag from which he produced, without ceremony, 4 tomato plants in small pots, their stems slightly lopsided from the drive, their labels handwritten in the careful script of someone who grew things intentionally. "From my mum's greenhouse," he said. "She insisted." I took them, they were warm from the car. "Tell her thank you." He looked around the garden with the evaluating eye of someone who actually knew about growing things, which I did not. He pointed at the raised beds. "Those need turning before you put anything new in." "I know. You haven't done it. I have been busy." "You're here now," he said, with the easy directness of youth that had stopped apologizing for itself and went to find the spade. Fiona Marsh had packed her recorder away and was watching this exchange with the expression of someone recalibrating what kind of story she was writing. I did not help her with that. Some things do not need framing. I sat in my garden chair with the 4 tomato plants in my lap and watched Owen work the soil with competent, unhurried movements. And I thought about the word I had said 6 months ago in a spherical chamber 60,000 kilometers from here, and how it had traveled at the speed of light in every direction, and how somewhere out there, in the vast dark between the stars, it was still traveling. There is no wall in the galaxy thick enough to stop a clean signal. The spider was still working between the canes. The lavender still needed trimming. The journalist was quietly finishing her tea. Owen was talking to the soil in the particular low, half-absent way that people talk to things they are trying to help grow. The stars would come out later. They always do. They are not indifferent, I have decided. We only thought they were because we had not yet said anything worth hearing. Now we have. Let them listen.